Hey, if you like the Book Fair podcast and are looking for something more fun and nostalgia focused, you can check out Animorphs 55, the podcast. Just this week, I was a guest on their show talking about book number 11, The Forgotten. The conversations on Animorphs 55 are funny, very laid back, and they themselves prioritize keeping their language family friendly, so it's okay to share with any young people in your life. So please check out Animorphs 55, the podcast. Welcome to the Book Fair podcast. My name is Anthony, and this week we have an interview with Kate Frick, a digital content librarian for school collections with Sora, an Overdrive app. There are some new releases to cover, as well as news about book bans from Ohio and Alabama, as well as some good news for the freedom to read in some unlikely places. Let's start with an interview with Kate Frick. Kate, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you, Anthony?
I'm doing very well. Can you start us off by introducing yourself for the audience and what your work is through Overdrive?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Kate Frick. I am a digital content librarian with Overdrive, working specifically with school libraries through the Sora app. So for those unfamiliar, Sora is a sister app to Libby that's specific to schools. Some things are pretty similar. So if you know the Libby app, you probably have a basic understanding of what the Sora app is like. But a lot of things are geared specifically towards students. So we have reading challenges and reading goals, things to kind of gamify reading for kids, and content access levels. So things that make sure that kids are seeing content that's age appropriate, deemed by their schools as age appropriate, that sort of thing. But for the most part, very similar to Libby. My role is specifically in schools in California. And I just help librarians basically to find content for their collections, to gather data and analyze how their collection is looking, help them fill gaps, to help them with curating collections within the app so that students can find the things that they are most interested in. And basically, just anything that they don't have the time or the resources for, that's my role.
And as a digital content librarian, what is your engagement with schools? How frequently are you emailing or calling with schools? Are you talking to them daily, weekly? And how many schools do you roughly work with?
Oh gosh, I should have been prepared for that second part of that question, um, because I'm not actually sure. I would have to check in with the account managers who I work with, who are like more on top of exactly the number of schools. But I mean, I'm talking to schools every day. Not every single school that I work with every day, but I'm talking to schools on a regular basis, emailing, having Zoom calls with them, having phone calls when they run into an SOS sort of situation to help. I'm trying to do this thing and I just can't figure out how to do it. Yeah, on a daily basis for sure. And I would say if I wanted to give a rough estimate, I mean it's at least like 80 schools, like school districts, at least 80 different accounts, but it's probably more than that because California is pretty big and we have a lot of partners. But, am I working with every single one on a daily basis? Some it's like I hear from them, every so often, like 2 or 3 times a year when they really need something, because otherwise the person in charge is like really on top of it and they know what they're doing and they don't actually need me. And there are some where I'm doing things for them once a month on a regular basis. Here are your new content carts. Here are some recommendations. We're going to have a meeting and chat about things. So there's kind of a spectrum of when I'm talking to people. And all of our digital content librarians work with tons of schools. Some just have more states than others. I'm only in California, but I have two different account managers because of how large California is and how many accounts there are, how many different schools there are to work with. So yeah, everybody kind of has an equal number, I would say, of schools that they're working with or partners that they're working with, but we're kind of scattered across, how many states you're working with.
And when you mention being a digital content librarian and talking about procuring material for libraries, a lot of people may think something like a bookseller where you have just a wholesale list of titles. Can you break down what it's like selecting titles? How involved are you in recommendations, and how involved are you with like reviewing titles?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm pretty involved with recommending to the schools that I work with. Like I said, it really depends on the needs of that school and how busy the particular school administrator is, the librarian who's in charge or whoever it might be who does the all of the Sora work. But I'm building carts for schools all the time, and those are titles that I'm kind of going through and saying these are the ones based on, how what our budget looks like, based on the students that we're serving and their interests. These are the titles that look like the ones we should be adding. And then it's obviously up to the school and the person who's in charge to say, yeah, I do like these, or I'm actually going to take these out for whatever reason. Maybe they know a little better. Like my students actually aren't interested in this one or whatever it might be, and then they go through and do that process. But yeah, I mean, I'm heavily involved in that. I don't necessarily do in in terms of like full book reviewing. I don't do that anymore. But I did used to. Something that I didn't include in my bio. I did briefly work for a school library journal, but I also reviewed with School Library Journal for years before that, as well as for ALAs. They're called the Rainbows now, but the LGBTQIA committee. So I've done reviewing in the past of actual content. I do a lot less of that now, but I do blog for the Libby Life blog. So I get to kind of book review.
Outside of researching for specific schools and their specific needs, are there any titles that you would personally recommend that this is what a student, these are books that every student should read before they graduate, before eighth grade, something like that? Like, what are your go to recommendations
Oh my
outside of
gosh.
digital content curation?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. It's so funny because I literally went through my reads from this year to pick out my favorites of the year, but I wasn't prepared for like the favorites of all time that I feel like you have to read. That's such a good question. I might think a little more about that, but if you're open to my favorites of the year so far, I have some really good ones. I made notes because I was like, this question will surely come up.
No, no, absolutely. I think that one thing that I love doing on this podcast is whenever you're talking to people about children's literature, the main thing that you forget about is you're writing or developing material for young readers, but you are marketing it to adults
To adults,
because
yeah.
librarians, teachers, parents are the people who actually purchase the books. So a lot of times, nostalgia will kind of play a part into what books they're looking at getting. They're going to get the books that they know. So I always love talking about what's modern, talking about contemporary authors and contemporary books. That's a big part of the reason why I do this show is I want to look at what's coming out this week and what's going to be relevant to young readers this year. So absolutely, favorites for the year. I would love to hear what some of your favorites for the year are.
Yeah, I also just briefly want to touch on the point that you made there about how adults are the ones selecting. I always try to keep that in mind when I'm picking titles to put into a cart is I am an adult looking at these books. Adults are the people reviewing these books. So when I'm looking at a review and I'm seeing that reviewer maybe thought it fell a little flat, but that's the worst thing that they have to say, I'm thinking, okay, but is a kid going to think that? Like is the kid who this book is actually intended for going to think that this book fell a little flat, or are they going to see one of their favorite authors has a brand new book out and they're just excited because they love that author, and to them that story is great because like kids aren't adults, they're not reading for the same reasons than an adult is, they're not picking things apart. So I always try to keep that in mind of like, okay, maybe I didn't love this book, but you know what? I think a kid's gonna love this book. So I love that point of yeah, I always try to separate that in my mind. But okay, favorite books of the year so far. I have a couple of graphic novels that I've really loved. Millie of the Manor by Karina Evans. If you haven't read that one, it's about a young girl who has severe social anxiety, and she doesn't really talk to anyone at school. She just sits and reads her books. But one child from the school invites her to a murder mystery themed birthday party out of nowhere. She's like never talked to this kid before. um, and she's so anxious and she doesn't really want to do it, but her parents encourage her to go. And she kind of thinks about, as they present it to her, that she can become someone else for the murder mystery party. Like that's the idea, is that you're playing a part and maybe that makes it easier to be in this situation, but it deals a lot with what living with anxiety is like and how this girl is feeling as she's trying to navigate this situation. And it's just like really beautifully done. It's so cute, but it's also like, I think a really good portrayal as someone who I don't have that severe of anxiety, but I do have anxiety tied into OCD, and so I definitely I felt that. I was like, "Oh, man, I have been this kid before." And how great for kids to see that representation and maybe see themselves or see a friend that they didn't really understand what was going on with them before. So that one I highly recommend, Millie of the Manor. My second graphic novel favorite of the year was Dan in Green Gables by Ray Terciaro. It's a modern reinterpretation of Anne of Green Gables, of course, but Dan in Green Gables is about a half Latin gay kid whose mom, he's been traveling all over the country essentially since he was little with his mom, who is not the best role model. And he's done a lot more of taking care of her than she has of taking care of him. And at the beginning of the story, she's taking them to, I think it's rural Tennessee. And he doesn't really know why they're driving through here. And then suddenly they're at this house in the middle of nowhere, and this old woman comes out, and she's so thrilled to see him. He has no idea who she is. Turns out it's his dad's mom. His dad died when he was very young, and his mom presents it as we're coming to see them, but then in the middle of the night, she's gone. She disappears. She's not there the next morning, and he's been dumped with these grandparents. His grandmother is thrilled to have him. His grandfather is not, because he does not present the way that he thinks a young man should. And so it's a lot of navigating this rural environment that he's not used to, where he's been able to express himself as a young queer kid up until this point, and that is not the environment that he's been dropped into. But it's also about like generational trauma and healing that, and it's just a really well done story. Ray Terciaro is an incredible graphic novelist. His reinterpretations of classics, I think, are always phenomenal, but this one, like, it really got me. And then I'll just name one more. I had so many that I wrote down, but I'll name one more that I especially loved. An Encantadora's Guide to Monstros and Magic by Sarah J. Mendonca. It's about a kid who is like working as an apprentice to her grandmother in, it's like a fantasy world, but she's working as an apprentice to her grandmother as a monster catcher, basically. But she wants to be an encantador. She wants to be doing magic. And unfortunately, the way the society is built is that you have to have money to do that. You have to have status. And they don't. She's poor. The society they're living in is very much built against her and people like her. And then she finds out about this contest with a, not so reputable organization that's planning to do a heist. And so it's very like Ocean's 11, but make it magical for kids. And I just loved it. It was incredible. And they very much set it up. The ending is very, very much set up and poised for a sequel. So I'm super excited to see what comes next. But if you enjoy fantasy, you enjoy a good heist, I would highly recommend it.
And so, Kate, one of the through lines that come through in some of these titles, and specifically in your history as working in the LGBTQIA committee for the school library journal, is representation and inclusivity. Can you talk a little bit about why having representation matters, especially in the LGBTQIA community, which represents about 1 to 2% of the population? Why is it important that we represent these groups in specifically children's literature?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is that books give you language and they give you tools for conversations, for figuring out who you are, for understanding others, for unpacking trauma, right? Like all of these things are things that books give you a safe space to explore and to understand and then to prompt conversations. And so I think that that's the first thing, is that books are a safe way for kids to be introduced to new concepts and new ideas, or to better understand themselves. As someone who is queer and disabled, books, I think they make me feel seen when I see that representation, right? But they also help me as an adult to find the right words. I actually just happened to be, this is really great, is because you asked this question. I'm sitting right next to, so this book is a quick and easy guide to they, them pronouns, which was when I first read, like 10 years ago, if that, first read about different pronouns and first had an understanding of people using different pronouns. And that was when I first started to ask myself if these things like really fit me, right? I'd heard people, like, I was at New York Public Library, I'd heard people putting pronouns in their signatures, and I just didn't like, it wasn't that I didn't want to be inclusive. That's always been really important to me, but it was like none of these things feel like they fit me, right? Like none of these feel right. I use they them pronouns now, but at the time when I read this book, there was a throwaway line about some people not using pronouns at all and preferring that you just use their name. And I was like, huh, maybe that's me. Maybe that's why this is like hard for me to figure out is that like I don't see myself in a pronoun. Like none of them feel right. And so I tried that out for a while, which is actually my full name is Caitlin. And until then I'd gone by Caitlin. And that was when I said, hey, could you start calling me Kate? Because if if I'm gonna ask you to not use pronouns, I should probably make my name easier. Like I should make it a little easier for everyone. Let's just use Kate. And I think like that was me as a 25-year-old, right? Like, imagine a child. Imagine if I'd had that access at a younger age. If if I'd had books in middle school about queer kids, I think I would have understood a lot sooner the feelings that I was having for girls at school. I think I would have felt a lot more like there's nothing wrong with me and these feelings are completely normal, as opposed to feeling like those feelings were shameful. And I luckily grew up in a household that was pretty welcoming and accepting, not, you know, necessarily full stop, but although it's gotten a lot better, I will say, but a lot of, you know, we love everyone no matter what sort of mentality. But I still, even in that, I then was saying to myself, well, I can love people who are gay who are not me because I've been told that that's acceptable. But what I'm hearing at home is that being gay is not okay, but we love them anyway. So I can't be gay because being gay is not okay. Um, so, you know, imagine if I had had access to those things, right? And those were not books that existed on the scale that they do today when I was a kid. And with censorship on the rise, those are books that might not exist for kids moving forward. And I think that's a disservice and a travesty that those kids could potentially have that same experience that I did when instead they could see themselves or see others fully reflected.
And you mentioned at the end there that these books that are more inclusive are becoming more and more readily available, which is again why I love looking at contemporary books. What's happening in modern children's literature is so much more inclusive and diverse than it was when I was growing up reading the books at the Scholastic Book Fair. It was the broad spectrum of types of people being represented is absolutely amazing, and the fact that so many people are able to be seen and represented in books is absolutely wonderful, but there is also the ongoing battle with censorship. Can you talk a little bit about dealing with censorship? Is that something you even see as a digital content librarian? And what is your takeaway about the book ban debate?
Yeah, so it definitely is something that we see as digital content librarians. Obviously, we're not on the front lines in those schools, but we are getting those concerns from the school librarians who say, you know, this is the latest bill or this is the thing that looks like it's going to happen. And I understand where they're coming from and that fear because, you know, you need a job, right? You don't want to risk that you're going to get fired because you picked this book that suddenly becomes the new challenge. And also, I think that there's something to be said for standing up and speaking out and building a community that can support you in that, you know, finding those students and parents who are willing to speak up and out about how they don't want books censored. They want their kids to have access, right? They want those things. And there is power in that. We've seen that the documentary Band Together, we've seen the power of when people organize and speak out against what are largely challenges coming from organized groups, right? I think I have a stat here that I did pull. Yeah, it's from ALA's 2024 book ban data. They showed that 72% of challenges are originating from pressure groups or government entities, including school administrations, school boards. They're not coming from parents largely. They're not coming from parents who have concerns for their kids. They're coming from groups that have been organized specifically for these reasons, right? And I think when librarians find those supports and when parents and patrons of the library are willing to speak up, in support of their libraries, in support of their librarians. There's power in that. And I think that's, there's a lot to be said for obviously you have to have something to back you up. You have to have good collection development policies. You have to have the right tools. ALA has a lot of great, which is the American Library Association. I've been throwing ALA out. I should have said earlier for anyone who doesn't know, the American Library Association has a lot of great tools and resources for school libraries and public libraries facing challenges that you can find on their site. So being prepared and being ready when these challenges occur, I think is a huge important thing. Having that support from your community is a huge important thing. But I also absolutely understand that fear. I just think that I'm speaking from a spot of privilege. I understand that as I'm
Mhm.
not in a school library. I'm not in a public library at this point. But I think that when we start to give in to that fear ahead of time, when we start to self censor, that's when censors really win, right? That's when book banners really win, is when they don't have to do anything except for exist as a threat.
The group from that documentary was a primarily student led organization. Can you talk about what resources do young readers have in combating censorship in book bans?
I mean, I think this is the challenging thing, right? Is that students don't often recognize or know the right places to go. But I think that sites like ALA, the Office of Intellectual Freedom, they can help students just as much as they can help educators. There's another site, and of course, because we're talking of Unite Against Book Bans, that has a lot of great resources because it helps to equip and mobilize public advocates of the library within their community. They have a lot of great resources, including book resumes on books that are coming out as challenges. I think you can even submit requests for new resumes through their site. But basically, they compile review data, publisher data, awards, anything like that into a resume that is freely and readily available to anyone as long as the book is listed on their site. Teaching books, a little bit of a shameless plug for something that's connected to Sora, but Teaching Books also offers book resumes. It is a part of the paid package, but if a school has Teaching Books, you can get a book resume for any book that is in Teaching Books. So some great resources. And I think for kids, the best resource is your librarian. Unfortunately, some libraries just don't have those. So, speaking more on the school library side. So the people in charge of the library, maybe your English teacher, right? Like someone who's passionate about literature. If you have parents or caregivers who are supportive of you reading and learning and growing, they can be a great resource, right? So I think for kids, it's knowing where to look. And if you have a trusted adult who can help you, then that's the first stop, in my opinion. That's the place to go. And for grown-ups, it's knowing where those resources are. So it's knowing about ALA, it's knowing about Unite Against Book Bans, it's knowing that those resources exist to help you prepare in advance or help you deal with a challenge as it occurs.
And Kate, any last words before we close out the interview?
I don't really think so. I think I just want to say that I hope anyone listening is reading broadly and diversely all the time, right? Reading banned books is so important, reading those books that are being challenged, but any book could become a banned book. And it's so important that you continue to read those books, you continue to talk about those books, and more specifically, that you're borrowing them from your library. I hope that's the case. I hope you're supporting your public library, your school library, because those checkouts matter. They keep those statistics. They're not keeping, your name attached to it, right? But they are keeping that book was borrowed. And the more times that those books are borrowed, the more that we can prove that these books are valuable and that they need to be there. So I hope that anyone listening is really taking that to heart and remembering that you matter even if what you're doing is just borrowing the book and telling your friends about it. Your voice matters.
Thank you. That was an interview with Kate Frick. Sora through Overdrive offers digital content to schools worldwide. Check with your school or local library to see what Overdrive services are available. Educators and librarians can go to soraapp.com to learn more about setting up digital catalogs for your school. Next, we'll be looking at some new releases. But first, if you appreciate the work being done on the Book Fair podcast, there are a few ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, favorite, or subscribe wherever you are currently listening to help push the show to new listeners. Second, you can follow the show on Blue Sky or Instagram at BookFairPod, or go to patreon.com/thebookfair. On Patreon, episodes are posted early along with links to news sources used throughout the show. Following is free, and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Lastly, the best way to help support the Book Fair podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now, on with the show. Let's take a look at some new releases, starting with At the Speed of Gus by Richard Scrimger. A tween embarks on a hijinks-fueled quest to meet up with his older sister in this frenetic novel by Scrimger. According to his doctor, 13-year-old brain works differently from those of others. It moves quickly, but doesn't brake or steer well. His beloved 19-year-old sister Ruby and his classmates think his tendency to lose focus and daydream is funny, but it frustrates his mother and other adults in his life. After Gus goes off script while reading the morning announcements at school, despite disciplinary warnings from his principal, his subsequent 2-day suspension prompts Ruby to enlist his help in packing up her college dorm room. Throughout Gus's journey to the nearby university, which necessitates taking a ferry and 2 buses, the white-cued protagonist's rapid-fire stream-of-consciousness narration details his surreal and sometimes frightening encounters, both literal and imagined. As a scene in which Gus presumably falls off a yacht is revealed to have only been in his mind. Though the cause behind Gus's fast-moving brain and occasional hallucinatory episodes remains unexplored, brief text addresses it as an attention deficit. The youth's persona suggests a self-assuredness. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. Next is Down Came the Spiders by Ali Russell. Russell weaves spine-tingling chills into this character-driven tale of friendship and courage. 12-year-old Andy, a shy black girl who finds spiders more fascinating than people, would rather spend October 31st trick-or-treating and binging horror movies than awkwardly navigating a party. But Andy's 2 best friends persuade her to attend popular classmate Clementine's Halloween bash, luring her with the promise of viewing the host's father's unusual spider collection. At the party, the trio make their way to Clementine's father's office, which contains Specimen 17, a mysterious red-eyed, basketball-sized spider in a terrarium who exerts a hypnotic pull on Andy. After the creature escapes containment, adults suddenly vanish, and hordes of spiders descend on the house. Now Andy must rally her peers to confront the swarm. Taut prose briskly sets the stage, humorously capturing the two's social landscape while deftly juxtaposing Andy's feelings of anxiety, loneliness, and self-doubt with her growth into a steadfast leader. A somewhat unfulfilling resolution is offset by tense action, chilling atmosphere, and a delightfully icky premise, making this an ideal read for fans of creepy crawlies and light scares. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. And the final book to cover this week is The Stolen Songbird, written by Judith Eagle and illustrated by Joe Rio. In a 1959 set adventure novel by previous collaborators Eagle and Rio, aspiring gymnast Caro adores traipsing through Waterloo with her beloved rabbit, named His Nibs, and her fashion maven best friend Horace. The 12-year-olds are especially drawn to an area known as the Rubbles, where they plan to construct a gym with the help of Caro's world-famous Whistler mother when she returns from a South American tour. But when Caro's other mother is called away, Caro is sent to stay with her dour great-aunt Mary, called Gam, who believes that children should be closely supervised and forbids her rabbit from accompanying Caro. Caro manages her frustration over Gam's rigidity by secretly caring for His Nibs and sneaking off with Gam's young ward Albie to meet up with Horace. After Caro discovers a mysterious painting in her suitcase, she becomes embroiled in the machinations of a dangerous gang known as the Snakes. Stakes and tension ratchet ever higher across the central mystery, which is populated by an expansive, vividly rendered cast that cue as white, save for Horace, who is Bahan. A meticulously drawn historical setting and layered depictions of the comfort of animal companionship and the benefits of free play further enliven this zesty, expertly paced caper. This book is recommended for ages 8 to 12. And finishing out this week's episode with some news, starting with Ohio's recent implementation of what they call the Parents' Bill of Rights. Previously on the Book Fair podcast, we've discussed policies put in place in Florida public schools allowing parents to opt out of instructional materials that may be explicit in nature or contain, quote, gender ideology. We saw that shockingly few parents choose to opt their students out of such classroom instruction materials. In April, Ohio passed House Bill 8, called the Parents' Bill of Rights, that mandates parental notification regarding activities and student health information. This includes outing trans students to their guardians, even in cases where they may not feel safe disclosing that information to their parents themselves. HB 8 on the state level implements guidelines for schools to provide information about instructional content that deals with sexual material, which impacts titles like Speak by Lori House Anderson, that is frequently used to educate students about sexual abuse and has been cited in court cases for giving victims strength to come forward about their own abuse. Where Ohio schools would be required to send information to parents about material that may be labeled as sexual being used in instruction, such as sex education or classic literature, it also requires notification of content that falls under gender ideology and offers guardians a chance to opt out their students, which again, we have seen parents rarely choose. Bellbrook Sugar Creek School District took the opportunity to piggyback on the state law, drafting their own district-wide policy, also called the Parents' Bill of Rights, adopting the policy shortly after in April. The major difference between BSSD's policy and the state's HB 8 is that the new policy does the exact opposite. Instead of offering parents the chance to opt out of certain materials, they must now opt in. The difference doesn't sound like much, but the distinction between opt-in and opt-out in this case is massive. Classroom instructions relating to sex education, covering classic literature or social studies, looking at different family dynamics, are essentially being deprioritized in opt-in districts, where material that could be impacted by HB 8 are instead being made optional by default. Similar to school districts in Florida choosing the opt-in path instead of the incredibly low rates of parents pulling students' access to materials, we see far more that simply don't elect to give permission to optional schoolwork or instruction. There are a few factors at play here. First is the fact that these materials are being presented as optional to begin with. Second, there may be guardians that are just less involved due to work or complications related to the living situations of students. And third, there could be a language barrier with trying to get guardians to read and sign permission slips. Instead of electing equitable access for all students, not just in classrooms but in libraries, they are adding a barrier for students' abilities to find information. If there are questions related to sexual health that the parents are not able or willing to provide, information is publicly available, but having access to age-appropriate materials through the school's library is a good thing. Targeting gender ideology marginalizes children and their families. If a student lives with two moms or two dads, they deserve representation, as it helps promote acceptance and prevents bullying in schools. And what conservatives fear the most, the mere fact that queer and trans adults were once queer and trans children. These students deserve access to books that reflect their lived experience, just the same as everyone. But when BSSD passes a parental bill of rights that unintentionally lets some students fall between the cracks, the question then becomes which parents have rights? Which parents are we listening to? The answer here, thanks to Bellbrook's Sugar Creek School District, is the conservative and bigoted parents that want to hide certain kinds of people from their children. which then impacts other people's children. When the school year began, the high school library shut down while the sole librarian combed through the collection to identify which books may be seen as inappropriate under the new policy. This only shows that when school policies take this extreme route of making the restriction of titles the default, it puts a burden on library staff, and more importantly, during the time it took them to review their collection, the library was completely closed to all students. These extreme measures from censorship advocates are detrimental to students, and taking away access to sex education material only adds to the risk of abuse. But more on that later. Next, the Alabama Library Board bans gender ideology. Most states have libraries run within counties or cities. However, in Alabama, there is a single district run by the Alabama Public Library Service. And last month, the APLS voted to restrict books for minors that address transgender procedures, gender ideology, or the concept of more than two biological genders. As is typical with book banning laws, there is no definition for what is considered gender ideology, and the new policy lumps any books that discuss transgender people with items considered obscene, sexually explicit, or any material deemed inappropriate. Books like Melissa by Alex Gino or the works of Kyle Lukoff, which are written for young readers, will now be removed from sections of public libraries available to patrons under the age of 18. John Wall, chair of the Alabama Public Library Service Board and the chair of the Alabama Republican Party, stated that the decision marked an incredible day for the people of Alabama, putting parents in control of what their children are exposed to. Book bans do not give control to every parent. They cater to the minority that refuse to acknowledge diversity in the world and wish to raise their children in an echo chamber. Instead of giving parents the right to choose, APLS have elected to remove resources based on personal, typically religious beliefs that will impose their worldview on others. Read Freely Alabama, PEN America, Every Library, and the Alabama Transgender Rights Action Coalition released a statement criticizing the new policy change, regardless of their age relevance, moved to adult sections of public libraries in Alabama. The language in the code change does not define gender ideology, a vague, undefined term often used as an anti-LGBTQ dog whistle. John Wall introduced other amendments that the APLS adopted, establishing a library card program that requires minors to have explicit permission from legal guardians to check out books from the adult section of the library. An important distinction here is that the adult section is essentially the general fiction section that makes up most of a library's collection. Children's sections are curated specifically for young readers, where the adult section is more of a catch-all for general fiction. Even high school students wanting to borrow classic novels will not be able to borrow any titles without parental permission. These programs are going to create unnecessary barriers for enthusiastic readers to continue their journey. When I was in middle school, I borrowed Stephen King books from the public library. And today, I wouldn't be who I am if I was restricted to reading books that I felt were below my reading level. Restricting access to most of a library's collection will only do harm if you have the goal of encouraging young people to read. The changes with APLS did not stop with gender ideology. Previously on the Book Fair podcast on May 1st, then again on October 10th, the Fairhope Public Library had its state funding frozen by the APLS due to decisions to keep challenged titles on teen shelves. The APLS board chair said on a Zoom meeting that he hoped an agreement could be reached to return funding, whereas the director for the Fairhope Library held firm that the branch was compliant with the library policy, that what is considered inappropriate is inherently subjective. Rightly so, as nowhere in the official language is the term adequately defined. After the vote to restrict gender ideology, the APLS board delayed a vote to reinstate funding to Fairhope Library. The funds have been frozen since March, and while the Fairhope Library had reached a decision on challenged materials, by continuing to delay the board vote, the APLS is choosing to hold funds hostage over the library branch's decisions not to remove titles from the teen section. The battle between Fairhope and the state library has been brutal, with the branch being forced to return $22,000 to the state, for which Wall was pressured to publicly apologize, though the money that Fairhope had received was given back to the state until APLS votes on compliance with library policy. During meetings, John Wall has seen criticism from the public as well as fellow board member Ron Snyder, who said, quote, "Are you becoming the censor-in-chief for Alabama? That you are reading these books?" End quote. Next, a quick story following a State Department head's controversial use of a picture book character. On November 30th, Pete Hegseth posted on social media an illustration in the style of a Franklin the Turtle book cover with the title Franklin Targets Narco Terrorists. Along with the image is the caption for your Christmas wish list. The image is in response to the controversial military strike on a boat alleged to be carrying drugs from Venezuela with intention to bring them to the United States border. The discourse online regarding the strike claims it could be considered a war crime. However, the scope of this podcast is to take a look at the image that Defense Secretary Hegseth posted using the image of a children's book character to celebrate militaristic attacks on alleged drug trafficking suspects. The day after the post, Toronto-based publishing house Kids Can Press released a statement online. Quote, "Franklin the Turtle is a beloved Canadian icon who has inspired generations of children and stands for kindness, empathy, and inclusivity. We strongly condemn any denigrating, violent, or unauthorized use of Franklin's name or image, which directly contradicts these values." End quote. NPR reached out to the Pentagon for comment, and Sean Parnell responded, doubling down via email, quote, "We doubt Franklin the Turtle wants to be inclusive of drug cartels or laud the kindness and empathy of narco-terrorists." End quote. War is a harsh truth of the world, and there are many books for young audiences, some from author Alan Gratz and the I Survived series, that give context to the weight and severity of conflicts. And here, the current administration is making light of the extrajudicial deaths of non-militant citizens of foreign countries. This comes along with President Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Hegseth having unofficially renamed the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Like the publishers behind Franklin, I push for stories that promote kindness, empathy, and inclusivity. Things that the current federal administration of the United States have made painfully clear they oppose. Finishing out this week's episode with some positive news for the freedom to read. The Sumner County Library Board in Tennessee has voted down a controversial collection and development policy for a fourth time. The policy would have prohibited any materials subjecting, introducing, condoning, or encouraging a minor to identify with or live as a purported identity inconsistent with his or her biological sex at birth. Newly added member to the Sumner County Library Board, Riley Gaines, yes, that Riley Gaines, stated, quote, "We listened to the public comment tonight, and so I will be voting in favor of what the people of Sumner County made very clear that they want. We have the opportunity to lead the charge here in the state and nationally in removing this indoctrinating material from our libraries." End quote. Each time the book banning policy has made its way onto the board's agenda, the public has shown up in large numbers to voice their opinions. The community has been split, with some advocating for the policy and others calling it a slippery slope. Quote, "Right now it's transgender books, but what is it going to be next?" End quote. To that end, the Sumner Library Board reached a stalemate with a 4-4 vote, meaning that the policy has failed to pass. Opponents to the rule change state that libraries are public services for learning and open inquiry. Restricting access is a form of censorship. Those in favor of the change point to indoctrination and influencing children to become trans, something that is not backed by any evidence scientifically. Another story comes from the Fairbanks School Board in Alaska, where members reject a request to pull books from school libraries. During a meeting last week, board member Loa Carroll Hubbard asked fellow board members to help strengthen school district policy, saying, quote, "What I'd like to see is somehow specifically state that there should be no sexually explicit material in our libraries, period. Whether we're talking about elementary school, middle school, or high school age. I don't see any educational value in sexually explicit material, and I don't see any limitation on this policy for that kind of material. Carol Hubbard claimed that roughly 500 books in Fairbanks school libraries are sexual in nature, and that the board needs a clear policy in place to address community concerns. Board member Meredith Maple said in response, quote, "I trust our policies as they are written. The district has professionals that have been educated about what decisions should be in front of which audiences, what should be taught in a classroom, what should just be available for checkout, and what shouldn't be available in either of those places." End quote. The board went on to discuss whether the current opt-out model is sufficient to allow parents to control what students have access to, with Carol Hubbard wanting a more restrictive opt-in solution. One member said it best, quote, "Avoiding exposure to stories that depict real-life challenges is asking our students to turn away, to not see it, and I don't think it prepares them for the reality of the world to restrict them from access to these types of stories." When book bans are brought up, one common criticism is that guardians should have control of when and how to educate children on sexual education and other sensitive topics, such as abuse. However, when most abuse happens in the home and perpetrated by family members, children need an advocate outside of the home, someone that they can feel comfortable opening up to about concerns related to their living situation. Things like parental rights sound like a common sense argument against the freedom to read and educating students in public schools about sensitive topics. But when the worst thing that can happen to a child is being done to them by their own parent, taking away resources, safe spaces, mandated reporters, and advocates for their safety, you are co-signing the abuse and allowing it to continue. Whenever I post clips of the podcast, there are comments saying that exposing children to sensitive material is wrong, and that parents should be the ones choosing, or not choosing, to teach their children about consent and their anatomy. When children have age-appropriate sex education, it reduces abuse. And when it's left to their parents, people who are statistically likely to be the ones committing the abuse, an unfortunate side effect is that it will continue. So when school districts like Fairbanks and communities push back against book banning, they are helping to empower young readers and arm them with knowledge that can protect them. That is why the freedom to read matters, and why book bans are inherently dangerous. This will conclude another episode of the Book Fair podcast. If you wish to read more about any of these stories, as well as a citation on how sex education helps prevent abuse, there are links to sources that are included at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free, there are no posts hidden behind a paywall, and you can add the RSS feed to your preferred podcast platform for early access to episodes. Of course, if you wish to help support the show, like, comment, follow wherever you're currently listening, but the best thing you can do for the Book Fair podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.